To my right is Mr Michael Brown, member for Florey, Reggie Martin, member of the Upper House. To my left, Honourable Jing Lee, also member of the Upper House, Honourable Connie Benares, Sarah Game as well, and joining us by teams, the Honourable Tammy Franks.
Hi.
Georgia, do you have an opening statement that you wish to make?
Yes, so my name is Georgia Thomas. I am studying a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Adelaide, and this year I am fortunate to be the elected student president of our Student Representative Council.
Georgia, we'll just get you to speak to the microphone. They're directional
microphones,
so they're very sensitive. You might wish to move it to you.
Is that a little bit better if I'm like this?
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. So my name is Georgia Thomas. I study a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Adelaide. I'm roughly in my second year, and I'm this year's elected president of our Student Representative Council. The Student Representative Council is the peak representative body for students at the University of Adelaide. We are elected each year annually, and we come underneath the student union at the university, the AUU, now known as UX. So we sit underneath that, and we operate independently from the university. We work in close collaboration with them. We're the main advocates for students. We sit on university committees to advocate for student interests in policy review, new training modules. We're really there to provide an oversight of the student experience for university and advocate on issues where perhaps students in the university have different interests, because of course there's always going to be conflicts. So we aim to work productively with them and represent a broad variety of interests, from students who are really engaged and care about student issues to those who might simply be there to get their degree and get out into the workforce. So broadly, we've provided this submission because this is a topic that's of great interest to students at the University of Adelaide in particular. We have quite a different student culture to the University of South Australia, which I'm sure you'll hear about from Isaac following myself. This is an area that is a bit more controversial at the University of Adelaide in our student base, so it's something that I'm looking forward to representing some of our key issues on to you today.
Well, questions from members? Member for Florey.
We heard from the department who'd been responsible for providing the drafting instructions for the legislation previously. It was put to them the question about why it was that the student union didn't have, let's call it recognition in the draft bill. And their response was that by keeping the union separate from the legislation, it provided the union with a greater degree of autonomy. That the current legislative framework requires the constitution and I think also the rules of the student union to be essentially endorsed by the University Council. And then it was the department's view that not having the student union in the Act gave you that a greater degree of autonomy because of those reasons. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So within our written submission, one of our key issues is that the student union isn't currently represented in the legislation aside from a transfer of assets. This was quite concerning to us because in both the current University of Adelaide Acts and the current University of South Australia Acts, it does acknowledge the existence of a student union. And so seeing this omitted from the draft legislation immediately sort of raised some concerns with us. The fundamental reasoning behind why we're seeking or recommending that that does be included is because it helps to close a power imbalance that exists between the university and the student union. So the student union should be independent from the university, which the Department of Education has clearly echoed in their reasoning there. But we are concerned that if it's not concrete and it acknowledges a formal body of existence within the legislation, that there is room for that power imbalance to grow. So we currently negotiate with the university every year on our funding for the student union. So there is like an embedded power imbalance and relationship between the union and the university. And I think an element that is necessary is the formal acknowledgement. It legitimises the student union and it does allow us a better seat at the table heading into internal negotiations between the universities, where they will obviously work out the structure of the union, how the university will interact with the new union. If we are leaving it out of the legislation, our concern is that this puts it fully in the hands of the university to advocate for, and for the union will then need to go to the university, justify their existence, and have to work a lot harder to be involved in the room in negotiations moving forward. So it's quite important to us that where the Adelaide University Union is acknowledged as existing. I think in some elements it also goes into heritage concerns that quite a few people have raised about the merger. The Adelaide University Union has a really proud history of being one of the older student unions in the country, and we think honouring that in part of the transition will help keep the heritage and acknowledges our long-standing student union traditions in Adelaide. So it's important to us on a cultural level, but also on a level that sort of puts us more legitimately in the square of merger negotiations and allows the university to acknowledge us as a autonomous body that does have a bigger stake in the university.
So it's the university union's view that although you will obviously that you'd rather have a formalised position and structure position rather in the structure of the university than have that freedom to be essentially outside the formalised structure.
Yeah, I think it should be that broad recognition, not detailed to the extent that like University Council is, but within the current University of Adelaide Act, it acknowledges that it'll continue to exist as a body. It acknowledges the responsibilities that the union has to the University Council as part of that relationship. And of course, that relationship is essential, so it'll continue, but I think it just allows concrete standing for the student union moving forward. Yeah, in my mind, it's one of the more integral bits that we're advocating for as students.
Can I ask whether you've had any discussions with I know it's early days in a sense, but have you had any discussions with the student union at the University of South Australia about whether they have the same views?
We've only had more informal discussions, and both our existing student unions are structured a bit differently, as are most across the country. But broadly, I think we share goals of a strong, empowered and thriving student union on campus, and we think that's best achieved by it being legitimate so that we can work on an equitable relationship between the union and the university. So I do think it's a view that they would share. I think we both institutions really believe in strong student unionism.
Thank you.
Honourable Tammy Franks.
Thank you, and thank you for coming in, Georgia. And your support is really excellent. There's a there that's food for thought for this committee. I had a range of issues. Certainly, I was surprised to see that with the new Adelaide University Act that there wasn't a continuation of what I would have thought would have been the Adelaide University Union, as is currently in the University of Adelaide Act. And as a former USASA EVP and in fact the first elected undergraduate student at UniSA with the merger there in their first year, I was quite surprised to not see a student union in the Act. Did you have a heads up that that was going to be the case, or when did you discover that the student union had been left out of the legislation?
No, we only discovered that upon reading the draft legislation to inform our submission to the committee.
So when we had a representation from the department that this was something that would give you more autonomy and independence, had that been discussed with the student unions at all?
It hasn't been discussed with myself in my position, and discussions haven't happened that I've been aware of, no.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm also really interested that you've picked up on the university's accord, led by Mary O'Callaghan, the University of Adelaide herself. Could you just talk us through the importance of the student voice and an organised, resourced student voice in the transition process, in the life and the culture and the student experience at universities, and why you're arguing for the SSAF and the 50% guarantee?
Absolutely. So I was overall quite pleased with the Interim University's Accord report that was delivered a few weeks ago. I think it raised some really important considerations for the Accords panel in the lead up to their final report in December, and in particular what the Accords can mean for us as we establish a new university in South Australia, because as we mentioned in our written submission, we have a real opportunity to lead the way on some of those considerations and recommendations, so that we can, if we are having a new university, be forward-thinking and really looking at the next generation of students and how we can best serve them in accessibility and equity and quality of education. So some of the really key recommendations within the Accords that were of interest to me were about increasing student representation, particularly in regards to university councils, and sort of breaking down the power imbalance that I've mentioned beforehand between universities and student unions. So we know that students are the experts on the current student experience. So in our minds, it's a no-brainer that they should be included at the table in all discussions about the future of education. Where I think the Universities Accord will have an impact on us in South Australia is in those areas that I've mentioned. So on looking at how we breaking down the membership of the University Council, and that it should be led by people that have a focused interest and specialisation in the tertiary education sector. It should have representation from staff, because at the end of the day, staff teaching conditions are student learning conditions, and they should have a really good say in how the university is run. So we wholeheartedly back that recommendation from the interim Accords report that University Council composition does need to be geared more towards the education sector, towards specialisation in research outcomes, and including the voices of students most importantly. So I really affirm that, and I think breaking down the power imbalance between universities and student unions is done by that as a first step, but also through things like mandatory minimum SAF in legislation. That's worked really well in Western Australia to keep student unions thriving and providing essential services to students. At La Trobe University, they had over $1 million of funding stripped from their SAF portion from their university just a couple of years ago. And that's something that could not happen in Western Australia because of the safety guarantees around SAF in the legislation. So that's something that's real important to us. It means if we take stances that disagree with the university, there's no way for us to be punished for that. If we're advocating for students in a way that is not quite in line with the university, there's no repercussions to our funding or our existence. So that's something I really strongly believe in, and we don't want to ever end up in a position like the La Trobe Student Union is. We want to be thriving like the student guilds in Western Australia are. So I think there is a lot of lessons for us to learn from the Accords in the consideration and the planning of this university. I think both at a legislative level and later on in planning stages between the universities and their transition councils. But I really think the biggest opportunity for us here is to get on the front foot of the future of education in Australia, and plan and execute a really good university if we're going ahead with this. So the response from students at the University of Adelaide, I would observe, has been more negative than the response from students at the University of South Australia. And I think there is a lot of reputational elements influencing that. I think the University of Adelaide has historically been perceived as a more prestigious institution compared to the University of South Australia, which is not necessarily true in some elements of some degrees. The University of South Australia is much better on the equity front than the University of Adelaide is, which adds to the sort of exclusivity vibe that the university gives off. And so I think a lot of students, particularly international students that have potentially chosen the University of Adelaide for the prestige and rankings, are feeling a little bit annoyed that they are being merged with a perceivably lower ranked university. So I think there's some negative feelings on that front from international students. There's also just a general lot of anxiety around the idea that this could lead to worse conditions for students. So at the University of Adelaide, in the last couple of years, we've seen 5 of our faculties merged into 3, which has resulted in increased waiting times for assistants. It's resulted in decentralised offices for the faculties. It's much harder for students to gain help when they need assistance administratively for their degrees. So we've seen firsthand like the negative impacts that mergers can have on an internal basis. And so I think there elicits a lot of anxiety about a huge merger like this, you know, particularly when I think the marketing has not been well geared towards the interests of students. We spend a lot of time marketing this proposed merger as being about rankings or research outcomes, but the reality is once a student is enrolled at this university, those things are not of utmost importance to them. What is important to them is what support am I receiving, what services can I access, do I enjoy my classes, am I supported by my teachers and my faculty? And I don't think any of that has really been touched on, and I know that is partially because those elements come later in the negotiation process, but what students are hearing is that this is a financially motivated move. It's not being marketed towards them. So I think there's a lot of anxiety and hesitancy around, okay, well, this is just to make money. It's to squeeze more international students through the system. There's rumours of moving to trimesters. If we move to trimesters, it's just to get people through their degrees faster, to get more monetary turnover. So I think the way it's been marketed has not had a positive impact on students. We're not hearing that this will improve our experiences. You'll get a better degree out of this. You will learn more, you'll feel more enriched, and you'll come out of this a more well-rounded person. So I think the marketing has been a huge problem. The historical anxieties around the fact that students have been burned by mergers in the past and had worse outcomes and experiences at university. I think that's contributed to a lot of it. But, you know, on a cultural level, the University of Adelaide tends to be a little bit more switched on in that we're all primarily at the one campus. So we've only got 3 campuses compared to the University of South Australia having 5+. So we've only got North Terrace, which is where the majority of our students are. And so I think we're all very centralised compared to the University of South Australia, where you've got some students at City West, some at McGill, Mawson Lakes, Mount Gambier, Whyalla. So we're all quite connected to the campus. We feel a strong sense of community there, a strong sense of belonging, whereas I think at UniSA it's a lot more spread out. You're not as tied to this one historic institution. So I think there's a lot more anger coming from all those sorts of elements there compared to UniSA, where they're, in their eyes, potentially merging with a better ranked institution. They might have better outcomes, but in the eyes of students at the University of Adelaide, it just hasn't been well marketed, and there's just a lot of anxiety around it.
Thanks so much.
Honourable Connie Benares.
Thank you, and thank you for appearing, Ms Thomas, and for the submissions so far. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the negotiation process. And we all know there's always more than one way to skin a cat. So I guess my question to you is that, noting that the legislation that we have is in draft form, and that this inquiry is underway, and that there is then going to be a robust discussion in Parliament pending the outcome of all those things. If there was a way to address the issues that you've raised, particularly around the union, in the legislation or otherwise, if there were guarantees given to you, if there was a way of addressing it in the legislation without the restrictions that the department has pointed out to us, then overall, would the council be supportive of the merger?
I think the best possible outcome for students and for the legislative side of the merger to look as though it will lead to more positive outcomes for students would mean it would have to include our recommendations. And of course, our council is democratic, just like Parliament, so it sits on a vote at the end of the day. But the issues that we've identified and the issues that the University of South Australia's Student Association has identified are key improvements that we see, and if they're there, we think there will be better student outcomes, better student retention, and it will mean that this merger is poised to be something of benefit to students.
And would you be open to considering different ways in which they could be embedded in the legislation to ensure that your needs and wants are satisfied, but that we don't face any of the difficulties that, for instance, the department has alluded to in its evidence? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think while we've posed, solutions, I think they're not the only solutions. So the core issues are like recognition of the union, secure funding for the union, and ensured representation for students. And there's a number of ways they can be addressed. So we've just looked to refer to current examples, but I think those are the three underlying issues that can be addressed in a number of ways.
And I'm going to ask two in one now, so I don't take up everyone's time. But if you were engaged in that process, both through the consultation and direct discussions with government, I'm sure that would satisfy you to that degree, to a degree as well, in terms of having that input in what you've discussed. But I want to ask you this more importantly. You've talked about the uncertainty, you've talked about the concerns that students have raised, indeed that staff have raised, and we've also referred to the timing of this committee, and it's a tight time frame that has been set for this legislation. But do you think that potentially, if all those issues can be resolved in that tight time frame, that there's some acknowledgement on all fronts that there might be changes that are required, and they are done appropriately, then getting this done and dusted actually assists with that certainty, so that people can then make informed decisions about what they want to do, rather than dragging this process out over a protracted period of time where people remain uncertain about what their futures look like?
I think the sooner these important broad concerns are addressed, the better. And I think the tight timeline does make things challenging, but I think the issues that we're raising are in some ways straightforward and simple. It's very clear that these are the things we want to address, and I think they can be addressed adequately through legislation and through collaboration with the department and other bodies. I think the sooner it's addressed, the better, because it allows us to then focus on our next ambitions with the merger, which is around what does the structure of the student union look like? How do we sit as students in an empowered way within the university? So I think the sooner that legislative elements and issues are resolved, the better place that we are to then stand our ground and positioning in negotiations with the university.
Thank you very much.
The Honourable Tammy Franks and then the Honourable Jing Lee.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to come back to page 12 of your submission, and I think it's a really nuanced submission, and I really thank you for that. You've managed to communicate pretty forcefully what you think needs to be done, but also quite constructive. Point to some, what I think are pretty grave concern. I'm just going to read this back to you. You know it because it's got your name on it, but just for the purpose of the question. When the amalgamation was announced, many students and community members at the University of Adelaide were dismayed at the decision. The university quickly turned off comments on its announcement post, signalling that backlash was immediate. The SRC shares many concerns with these students and are yet to formally endorse the amalgamation. We have, however, chosen not to outrightly oppose the merger, deciding that engaging with them productively is better in order to achieve better outcome for students. And then you go on to raise your concerns with the current legislation. That's the draft one, it will say. Has, in terms of the communication with students, the burning off comments, does that give you comfort that feedback is really sought from the student body?
I did think it was in poor taste. The University of South Australia didn't do that in comparison, and I think social media tends to be the form of the most quickest, perhaps not most constructive, but definitely the quickest avenue of feedback that you can get. And so to me that was quite concerning, given that there was no other existing avenues for students to voice concerns aside from sending an email to a member of staff, and there's no direction on which member of staff that would be. The only other avenue would be coming through us, which again we struggle as a representative body with visibility when there are so many students at our university. So to us it was a bit concerning that it was done so fast, and it was a bit, there's no other formal avenues for students to provide feedback or their feelings and thoughts on this announcement, which is a huge one, and for a lot of students is one that is like, oh my goodness, like what does my university journey look like now? So it was frustrating for there to be no avenues of feedback for it, particularly after social media then was taken off the table. But we in terms of the sort of latter half of that comment from our submission, we have also been looking at what has happened in Western Australia recently, where they've also been looking into university mergers. And obviously they came to the conclusion that it was not the best thing at this point in time for the universities in Western Australia, but the student unions there led a really good example in putting their thoughts forward and voicing their concerns that contributed to them coming to that conclusion. And if we were to abstain from this process, if we were to simply take a hard stance against it rather than coming in and explaining perhaps why we could be against it or why we could be for it and what our concerns are, then this process would exclude students entirely, and it would have people who aren't students speaking up for what's best for them. When we've got genuine concerns, we've got genuine avenues of advocacy we can go down, and we've got genuinely good ideas to improve the student experience. And so it is really integral that we're engaging with the process. And if we were to come out to oppose it, we've got then reasonable grounds for doing so, in that we've said these are the improvements, they've been knocked back. Was no benefit for us to outwardly oppose it without coming to the table and saying this is what we want. And based on the WA merger discussions, if during the feasibility study we did a submission to the university about our priorities if the merger went ahead, if they came out and said, oh yeah, merger's off, council's voted against it, we've still put forward avenues for improvements to the student experience at our university. So there was benefits regardless. If the merger went ahead, we've got an opportunity to improve things through a merger. If the merger didn't go ahead, okay, we've still identified avenues for improvement at our own university. So we see huge benefit in engaging with it, and to not do so would be leaving students behind.
Thank you. And then in some promotion of the merger, I've seen you featured in an online story in Adelaide Now with your photo and quotes and a range of other students, and I think it was also several page splash in the Sunday Mail a little while ago. How did that article come about, and your role in it?
Yeah, so in my position as president, I was approached to provide some comments about the merger, that they were doing an upcoming spread in the Advertiser, And I think it's important that information is out there about the merger. I think it's a huge thing of community interest, even outside the university. And I think it's important the views of students are communicated in that. And of course, there is such a wide variety of student opinions. And so I thought it was excellent for them to have two quite different students from the two different universities comment on that piece and have the opportunity to say like what we're concerned about and like sort of where are things going from here, what's been going through our brains about the merger.
Yeah, thank you. But quite specifically, who approached you, the journalists or someone else?
I was in contact with the journalist that did the article and the photographer that contributed to the article.
Okay, I think there was two journalists, so was it the male or female?
It was the male one.
Okay. Did they make it clear that it was for an advertising, not for an article?
It was for a what, sorry?
Well, it's actually government-sponsored advertising, so it's advertorial,
Mm-hmm.
not actually an article.
Yes, yeah, so they did disclose that to me. They said that it was from the Department of Premier and Cabinet and they wanted to have a student contribution to it.
Right, thank you.
No worries.
Honourable Jingley.
Thank you, Chair. I think the
Motion to
Honourable
continue.
Tammy France already asked about the consultation process. That was what my original question was. But perhaps just follow up on some of the comments you made. Were you able to get any initial indication from the students that have shown their concerns or given feedback that if the merger is to go ahead and the particular submissions that you've made would not be incorporated in the legislation, were there any students indicated they would discontinue their studies, if the merger is going to go ahead because of all these uncertainties? Were there those concerns been raised?
I've had no concerns or discussion of intention to discontinue their education as a result of the merger. There's a lot of people that'll be in the crossover where if they graduate they'll get to decide what their degree displays. Everyone has said they will have the University of Adelaide displayed rather than Adelaide University, noting to the heritage and the fact that that's the institution they feel connected to. But I haven't heard of anyone saying they will discontinue their education as a result of it.
Honourable Connie Bennett.
I just have one supplementary, if I may, and just off the back of a couple of points that were just made, regardless of whether those media articles that you commented in were advertorials or not, I'm assuming from what you've said today that your focus was take the opportunities you have to get student voices heard, and notwithstanding that, that you've made your position clear that these are basically the non-negotiables for your council. Is that a fair assessment of what you've said?
Yeah, absolutely. Our number one priority in the merger discussion process all the way back from December last year has been about centering student voices, because students are the biggest stakeholders in university education. Universities don't exist without students, and if they're not at the forefront of discussions and communications and consultation, then the intentions are really muddy. So it's always been about centering student voices, making sure that students are included in any media about the merger, in any consultation. So that has always been our number one priority.
And you've made it clear that you have some non-negotiables, basically, from where the council sits. They might be subject to some change, but you have some non-negotiables in terms of openly coming out and saying, we support this merger. You see, well, I'm paraphrasing, but this is an opportunity, but these are the issues that we would like addressed as part of this process.
Absolutely. I think there are some really profound opportunities around equity, where the University of Adelaide has traditionally fallen further behind most of our counterparts across the country. I'm a student who comes from a rural background, so I've had to move to Adelaide to do my education. So even things like that can be a huge barrier to people, particularly with increasing costs. So I think we have a huge opportunity to improve equity and accessibility of our university, and part of that is support services during your time at university. So that's something I feel really passionately about in this, and something I think we have a huge opportunity to do. And again, UniSA has exceeded quite well at that, whereas University of Adelaide hasn't. So we've got an opportunity to open our doors to more vulnerable and disadvantaged students than ever before. But of course, we also hold concerns about wanting to have an empowered, thriving student union at the new institution. So while there are opportunities, it's just we really want this to be a good institution for students, and that's behind everything we're fighting for. And I think the opportunities are good for students, but there are places where we could fall behind that will then leave students behind.
Thank you.
Member for Gibbs.
Thank you, Georgia. Is it fair to say that if this merger goes ahead, that the timing of the accord actually can present itself an opportunity for a way forward for the institution?
I would absolutely agree. I think, again, South Australia really prides itself in being at the forefront of innovation and being progressive in what we aim to do with our legislation and our institutions. And I think we have a huge opportunity to take on board what is said in the University Accords and implement it at our new university. If we're aiming to be not just the biggest university in the country, we can be aiming to be the best, the most forward-thinking and the most supportive to students. So we want to see disadvantaged groups graduating at much higher rates than they currently are. We want to see retention rates higher, and we want student satisfaction to skyrocket. So I think the University Accords times really well with this, and like we've said in our submission, a lot of what was in the interim report really backs up our priorities as students. So we feel quite affirmed by it, and I think South Australia has a chance to lead the way.
Morelton.
Just arising out of your earlier answer in terms of access and equity, particularly for regional students, I'm interested in your take, as you're actually expert witness in this space, on the university's engagement with regional students and the way they do through, the smaller regional campuses, also the uni hubs and so forth. What opportunities do you think the universities, either as three separate or as two, with the merger going ahead, in either case, what opportunities do you think the university should be focusing in terms of not just their support for regional students who come to the city, but their presence in the regions?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an area I'm passionate about. Having moved for my own education, the University of Adelaide has made big strides in the last couple of years to improve our representation and acknowledgement of our two satellite campuses. So we have Roseworthy, which is our Pascagoula, and Waite, which sits near Irvray High School, so not quite regional but still disconnected from our main campus. And both of them are very specialised universities, or university campuses. So Roseworthy specialises in veterinary sciences and Waite specialises in winemaking and agriculture. So they serve very specific dedicated purposes and they do it very well. A big issue is the student engagement side of things with that. So they're well engaged with their degree and they have a high degree of degree satisfaction. But student engagement with the student union has really struggled. That's something we've been working towards, and on our council, just last year we introduced positions dedicated as representatives for those campuses, and that has really helped. We've had a particular focus on the mental health of our veterinary students out at Roseworthy and increasing counselling presence out there. So we've been working at the University of Adelaide to really improve our student engagement with those two other campuses, and it's an issue that we're acutely aware of and acutely advocating for. I think UniSA is, while Roseworthy is out near Gawler, it's still not totally inaccessible. It's an hour's drive. UniSA has a bit more of a unique situation with their Whyalla, Mount Gambier campuses, and I believe they also have a much higher online degree contingent than we do. And I think, again, there's the opportunity with regional campuses to have those highly specialised areas, but student engagement is really important too, because students are not necessarily just there to get a degree. University is a holistic experience where you grow and learn how to understand the world around you. So I think student engagement with those areas is really important. And moving forward in negotiations with the university, I'm really looking forward to ensuring that our Roseworthy and Waite officers remain engaged in the process about the future of their campuses and the future of how they're engaged with the university and the union. And I'm sure UniSA would probably feel the same about their regional and satellite campuses. But I do welcome the federal government's regional, out of the University Accords interim report, the investment into regional study hubs. I think that's also something that'll be of benefit to our students that study out in regional areas. So I think with the combination of attention to regional campuses and regional students in the merger, and the focus on regional students in the Accords, I think we'll continue to see engagement grow with them.
Very well. Thank you so much, Georgia, for your evidence today. It's been most helpful, and also for your written submissions. Transcript of today's proceedings will be available shortly.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.